One, two, three.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin. And can I remind you, if you've joined us this evening, that Scéalta is a production of Féile here in Féile and Phobail. And in conversation with me tonight is someone whose face I suppose most of you who tune in will know. And we're going to resolve a couple of mysteries around him. It's Barney Rowan. And one of the mysteries that you may well want to know is why Barney, why Brian. We'll come to that. But just let me give you a wee bit of his background. He is an award-winning journalist. He's a prolific writer. He's an author of many books. He's now recently a grandfather.
That's me, yeah.
So congratulations for that. And he's someone who has been, if not in the middle of, but certainly right up there with all of the major political developments that have been around us all and affected us all for the last 20, 30 years. So clear up the first mystery. Barney or Brian?
The only person that calls me Bran is my mother. And if my wife calls me Bran, I know to get out of the road. So it's always been Barney. It's been Barney since I was a youngster. I don't know why, but just one of those names that's attached to you when you're a kid and that travels with you through all of those years. Of course, when I was at the BBC, it was Bran Rowan because Barney was far too informal. But nobody other than my mother, who's still alive, 91 this year, calls me Bran.
Oh, but that's how you kind of know you're in trouble, when your wife starts to call you by your full name.
That's when you know to get out of the road.
That's you know when to hide. I said an award-winning journalist, and you're an award-winning journalist. You're a prolific
Whatever
writer.
that means.
Well, I think it means a whole lot, to be quite honest. You started journalism, I think, with the Sunday News.
Yeah.
You were a sports correspondent.
Well, so in the 1970s, I know it's hard to believe now, but I got run a bit.
Yeah.
Ran for Northern Ireland. Was Northern Ireland Junior Champion in 1977. Ran for a club called Willowfield Temperance Harriers. And learned further down the road, many years down the road, that Bobby Sands was also at that club, ran for it. Mike Nesbitt had run for Willowfield Harriers. I remember Martin O'Muller doing a tweet. He had heard that the three of us were at that club, thought we were all there at the same time. And he offered a king's ransom for the picture, you know. And I'd love to have seen a picture with Bobby Sands with his arm, you know, around Mike Nesbitt. But I knew the three of us weren't there at the same time. But we ran out of a street, out of a little band hall in Hindford Street, where Van Morrison.
That's East Belfast.
East Belfast, where Van Morrison grew up. So I was deeply involved in athletics at that stage, as I say. Ran for Willowfield Harriers, ran for a couple of other clubs after it. Got a couple of runouts for Northern Ireland. Was involved in the Northern Ireland Athletics Federation and became a member of a group called NUTS, the National Union of Track Statisticians. NUTS.
And you wouldn't say it when you were drunk.
You couldn't say it when you were drunk, but I think I was the youngest person ever invited to join them. So I was always interested in detail. So I compiled the statistics for the Northern Ireland Athletics Federation, was assistant secretary of that federation to a man no longer with us, a man called Les Jones, who went on to manage the British Olympic team. So in that period, I started writing for magazines like Athletics Weekly. That's what I wanted to do. I was interested in sport. You were chatting to me just before we started to record this interview about 1981. What I remember about 1981 was the United Kingdom Athletics Championships was allocated here for the first time, May 1981, in the middle of the hunger strike.
God.
And it was to be an Antrim forum on a bank holiday weekend. There was a TV programme at that stage called Nationwide.
Yeah.
You'll remember it. Yeah. Athletes were pulling out in big numbers. The event looked as if it was going to be a flop. I remember Mary Peters going on to Nationwide and appealing for them to come, that they would be okay. And the night before the event, I stayed in the Europa Hotel with Les Jones, who was the principal organiser of the event. And he said to me, things are going to be okay. I said, what do you mean things are going to be okay? I'm not saying what I said. But,
yeah,
but you can imagine. Yeah. Right, I'll let you imagine, just in case we're going out before 9 o'clock. But he said to me, we're going to do a news conference in the morning. He didn't tell me what it was about, but the next morning he announced that Steve Ovett, the then Olympic champion, was on his way. And Ovett came, ran the 1500 metres, won the 1500 metres at the meeting, saved the event, and was a regular visitor to this place for many years after that. So I'd always a bit of time for him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I thought he came when it was difficult.
Yeah.
I didn't have much time for Sebastian Coe, but you know, the big milers of that time, Ovett, John Walker, Raymond Coughlin, that's what my interest was. My interest was in running. Jim McDowell
Yeah.
was the athletics correspondent at the newsletter and the Sunday News at that stage. And I got to know Jim. You know, I actually managed a couple of Northern Ireland teams at a very young age.
Did you?
I did. And I remember one where kind of McDowell travelled with the team as part of the coverage of the event. So McDowell got promoted to some job within Century newspapers, and he asked me at that stage, would I be interested in scribbling a bit of athletics for the newsletter and the Sunday News? And I said, well, how does that happen? He brought me down to meet the then sports editor, a man called George Yates. That's how it happened. Beyond that, McDowell was appointed deputy editor and then editor of the Sunday News. And a training post came up outside of sports journalism within Century newspapers at that stage, a trainee sub-editor's post. He said to me, do you fancy having a go at that? And I said, Jim, how does that work?
How do you do it?
How do you do it? And that's where my learning began.
And I know this is something that you don't particularly dwell on or talk about, but one of the things that always impressed me about your correspondence, either writing or reporting, was you had lived the knowledge of. In other words, when you talk about the peace process, which we're going to come on to, it isn't something that's abstract to you, and it isn't. Conflict is not something that you've ever seen from a distance, but you've actually kind of your childhood in East Belfast. Was
Okay,
disrupted.
well, so the first place I lived was in Carrickhill.
Of course, yeah. All the best people do.
In Tyrone Street.
Yeah.
I was born in 1958. Went to the Christian Brothers there in Donegal Street beside St Patrick's. My dad had this bright idea somewhere in the kind of mid to late 60s that we would move to East Belfast. So we moved to the old Hollywood Road on the front of the Knocknagunny estate. They're not far from Garnerville and Sydenham. As we arrived into the early 70s, it was a different place.
Yeah, of course.
I remember playing football, you know, with the lads, and they used to call me Taggy. You know, I didn't know what that meant.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm talking about being a very, you know, I might have been 12 or 13 or whatever, so the kind of idea of conflict and what it would become and how I would later understand it was a million miles away from my life as a kid. But the house was attacked a number of times. You know, it ended up in grills. I remember the first night the windows came in, myself and my brother Michael were playing a game of Subbuteo, that soccer game on the floor, and my ma ran over the pitch. I think she busted every player that was on the pitch. And I was more concerned about the Man United and Everton teams than I was about the windows at that stage. But I can remember then, and this is a kind of childhood memory, I can remember these men arriving at the door in combat jackets and talking to my mother, telling her it would be all right, you know, it was nothing to do with them, they would look after us, so on and so forth. But it just became this constant kind of period of intimidation. It ended up the house was grilled. You know, we used to go to a small Catholic church at Sydenham there. I can remember it being attacked during, I think it was a midnight mass. The windows coming in, the priest running off the altar. I was talking to my sister about this actually just a few weeks ago, and she says, I always thought about why he opened the door, why he ran off the altar and opened the door. And you know, some of the men who were there, they went outside, the cars had been attacked. So that went on for a few years, not being able to get out of the house basically, Joe, you know, and eventually having to leave. And I can remember a couple of my uncles arriving one night to move us, and we were moving in one go. In other words,
that was it, yeah. They
weren't coming back. So anything we were taking with us, get onto the lorry or get into the van. And I suppose they may well have been in their 40s at that stage, and they weren't for hanging about. I can remember a couple of people were waiting to move into the house as we moved out of it. What I didn't know at that time, and what I only discovered more recently, we moved a couple of miles down the road to Hollywood, to a place called Wood End. And when I came to publish my most recent book, somebody said to me, you should speak to this lad, Conor Graham. He works or he owns Marion Press. Lives in Kildare, but he's originally from your hometown of Hollywood. And so last July I rang Conor, sorted out the contract for the book, had the yarn with him at the end of it, tell me about this Graham connection in Hollywood. And he said to me, look, Barney, there's not many of us left there, but he said, my father was Tony. I said to him, did you live at 29 Wood End? He said, how did you know that? I said, as you moved out of that house in 1973 or 1974, whatever it was, we moved in. I had never spoken to the lad in my life.
Amazing.
Never spoken to a lad in my life before. He was like 2 at that stage, or 3. I might have been 14ish. He went and he spoke to his sisters. His eldest sister, Gerald, was a childhood friend of my wife's. Val, they went to school together. Val had played in that house. So those are the dots that kind of join us up from 1970 to 2021.
And I know that you don't either suggest or indulge in the fact of that childhood experience, but I think it always did make the difference when you were reporting something that it's not abstract, it's something that you had personally.
Well, I suppose, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you said, what I mean, when I say I don't know how in my reporting career I ended up speaking with the IRA, the Loyalist organisations, those in intelligence, those in military, those in politics. And I can only imagine that there was something about that childhood of wanting to find out what was that all about. You know, because I couldn't work it out, probably didn't want to try to work it out as a kind of young teenager. But I think as your life develops, you become a bit more inquisitive.
Yeah.
So I kind of had worked out that, I suppose when I became involved in that reporting, both of the conflict period and the peace process period, there's no point talking to one side in this, and I don't think there's just 2 sides. You know, I want to make I want to make that absolutely clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there are many sides to our conflict. I also think it didn't just happen, that something happened to make it happen. And I think you think much more about that when you get beyond the conflict period. I think much more about things today than I thought about them in actual time.
Can I alert you, it'll get worse as these grandchildren keep coming, because you'll start to see life through their eyes.
Oh, of course.
You're now a journalist, you're now working for the Sunday News, you're doing all of that.
Oh, right, in the 70s, yeah, 80s, yeah.
You couldn't have been any more different from your predecessors. I'm thinking, for instance, Billy Flax, the BBC correspondent who had a wonderful reputation. But you're young, you're enthusiastic, you're starting to make your way in that world.
Still at that stage, no idea where that was going to end up.
Yeah.
So I can remember McDowell, as I say, gets me that start in a kind of freelance way in the sports department. I don't know if you can remember the sports journalist Dennis O'Hara and
oh yes, of course,
Jimmy Dubois, and you know, I get into these rooms and there are these big typewriters, you know, typewriters, somebody called them, you know, it's but
and the Duke of York.
But the Duke of York and the bar that we all drank in at that stage was Benny's A1 bar in Waring Street. Yeah. You only got in after 5 o'clock if Benny knew you. And but so I hadn't long started that training piece in Century newspapers when there was a strike. Don't ask me what the strike was about. I can remember being in this meeting, but anyway, we'd been deeply offended by something. It ended in a 10-week strike. So, and I mean, at that stage, I was young, I wasn't married. The A1 bar was the headquarters for the strike. I had a ball, to be honest with you. And, but at the end, and McDowell came on strike with us. McDowell was the editor, and he actually came on strike with us. And I remember, you know, when the strike ended, he wasn't going back. And he formed a small press agency, and I became a part of that. And it was out of that I got my first step into the BBC. There used to be a thing in the Rota, TBA, try Barney again, you know, and there were all the shifts that other people didn't want to do, like the overnight shift, midnight to 7 or 8 in the morning, or 4 to midnight, or whatever. And so it all just became this learning in progress, if you like. Joe. And I was saying to you before the interview, I managed to get hold of a number of stories around the mid to later part of the 1980s, which began to, I suppose, sharpen my interest in that conflict period, but also sharpen the interest of others in me. You know, I was starting to make a bit of an impression.
Yeah, of course.
So I can remember, you know, somebody telling me about this story about yourself and Dennis Donaldson going to Lebanon, I think it was,
Yeah.
to try to secure the release of the hostage Brian Keenan. And I was about to run this story, and somehow or other Danny Morrison, I think, found out I had it. He came on and said, look, if you run that story, whatever chance we have of getting him out, we'll not be able to get him out. You know, it'll fail in the kind of publicity. I'm pretty sure Adams phoned me directly, and I was still living in that house in Wood End at that stage.
With your mother?
With my ma and a few of my sisters probably. And but again, from memory, I think it's a Sunday when Adams rings the number. And you can imagine the patter. But anyway, it's look, if you would just sit, and if we get anywhere with it, we'll give you a shout. And I suppose that was one of those kind of first tug of wars between your kind of professional responsibility and your citizenship. You know, so do I get a headline, or do I sit back and allow people to try to secure the release of a hostage?
I actually think you've been more modest than you need to be. I mean, I think that, leaving that story aside, what you quickly built up was a sense of trust, that people around you knew that there was a bigger story. Mervyn Chase has a great quotation. Another journalist, he talks about one of your press conferences and scanning the room, and he says it was Prods, Probies and Peters.
That's right. That was the launch of my book, The Arm Piece, and it was in the BBC studio around 2002, 2003. I remember Brendan McFarlane was there and Danny Morrison was there, and everywhere they looked round there was a peeler. Or the director of prisons, the chief constable then, Ronnie Flanagan, was there. And I remember that night saying to people, Ian Paisley was there, Junior, and Nigel Dodds and people. A lot of media people, quite a few of the loyalists. And the BBC had a little club not far from the studio, and I said, look, I have a few kegs on. I said it's with Ian Paisley stout on. It says it's a pint that likes to pose for a while, and it's got an especially large head or big head. And you know, the place took it as it was meant.
Good humoured.
Bit of fun. And I remember, you know, some people headed back to the club, some people left. And I remember going into the BBC the next day and having a chat with one of the editors. I said, you know, in the club there last night, a couple of those loyalists sang. What did they sing? I said, well, one of them sang My Way, and the other one sang Me and Bobby McGee. You know, and that's the truth. Davy Irvine sang My Way, and Davy Adams sang Me and Bobby McGee.
Can I ask you a question? And it's always struck me as something, and I know from personal experience that you've kept people's views when necessary very private. The people, it struck me that the people who confide in you and who talk to you, more often than not for their own reasons rather than simply, but did they become friends? Did they become more than just a source?
Absolutely. I mean, I treat people as people.
Yeah.
I think that's how it worked. I didn't run round with a baggage of grievance over my back. So I was able to go for a pint with people.
Yeah. Or a coffee.
Or a coffee. But very often a pint with people. And you know, have a row with them. And that was okay. And so, you know, I became very close with David Irving.
Yeah.
In one of the first conversations we had. And remember, loyalism was always deeply suspicious of the media. And I think the first interview I did with David was at the beginning of 1994. And it was, I think, the first interview where he actually appeared on screen. you know, face on. I remember he had a jacket on and it was strobing. You know, like whatever it was, strobing on TV. He had a whack of notes on the table in front of him, and he was like a rabbit in the headlights. And this was this person who only a few months later became this very confident spokesman for loyalism. But as I say, one of the first conversations he had with me told me I wouldn't make a patch in a correspondent's backside. I think he put it more bluntly than that, actually.
Yeah.
But over the years, I became very close with him. And people used to say to me, is that not strange, you know, a journalist and a politician so close? Because they would have seen us out having a pint.
Yeah.
And I said, not strange at all, because actually we've developed a relationship where we both understand each other and we both can say absolutely anything to each other, and we did. I mean, I can remember during one of the Loyalist feuds, I found out there was a bit of mediation going on. He was involved. I put a camera outside. He went through the roof. You know, he went through the roof, but it was over the next day.
Yeah.
You know, but that developed, Joe, over a number of years. I remember actually going with him one day to the Raven Social Club, Castlereagh Street, across the road from the Short Strand.
Yes. Yeah.
Lad at the bar, he says to me, "Do you know so and so?" I said, "Do I know him?" He was one of the guys who'd given us hell when we lived in East Belfast, and I think he was more nervous about that than I was. But I took the view that whatever happened to us in the 1970s happened to so many people. We were just people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I remember Irvine having a pint with him one night, and he said to me, "Adams, give me a call. Jerry Adams, give me a call." I said, what was he talking to you about? He said he's making a speech, he wants to talk to the unionist community, and he asked me, what should I say? And I said, what did you tell him? I said, ask Paisley as his war over. Now Adams was probably expecting something like, you need to say this for us and that's for us and that for us.
Yeah.
And I remember when David died, I can say this now, I think, you know, I mean, I don't think it's breaking any confidence. Richard Macaulay rang me looking for a number for Don Purvis. And they wanted to continue that relationship, trying to build a relationship. And that took us through to 2007 when David died. And I can remember a couple of weeks before Christmas, so 2006, coming up to Christmas, I was in town and I was having a pint with Hugh Ord, the chief constable. And Irvine rang me and he said, would you pop round to the office, meaning in the Raven Club in Castlereagh Street? And he says, I want to have a yarn with you about something. So I popped round and with a few pints, with a few too many actually. I remember there was an old man sitting at the table beside us and he was writing poetry on a boogie docket. I offered him one of mine. He wasn't at all impressed. Irvine said to me, they want you to do the Christmas draw. I said, fuck off. Or words to that effect, right? Yeah. And I said, you got, but it was a wind-up. They had a big portrait of the Queen and 2 orange buckets and tickets in it and stuff. But anyway, I had this taxi driver who had driven me for years. He ended up in the club beside us. Irvine's wife, I don't know how many times she called him, Jeanette. So we get him up to the Braniel estate and he insists that both me and the taxi driver come in. Obviously hostages, you know.
Yeah. You're like a chair to that.
So Jeanette's not a woman for shouting, you know, she's a more calm and quiet woman you will not find. And but anyway, I remember getting into the house and I hate dogs, you know, terrified by dogs. And he had this dog and it had a very big head. Now, it might have had a very big head because I was seeing more than one of the heads. But I remember saying to him, is it okay with Catholics? He says, well, it wouldn't need a whole one, you know. And but anyway, that was the last time I saw him alive. And I spoke to him a couple of weeks after that on the phone. And he had an article he'd written that he wanted published. And the gist of the article was urging Paisley to make the deal with Adams and McGuinness in 2007. Let's finish the job. Yeah. And he had chatted to my son. He had phoned the house looking for me. He had asked one of my lads to spell Ardesh. It wasn't Ardèche when I read it in the copy anyway.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'd spoken to him. That wasn't a Freddie. It sent it to me under the heading "Usual Crap." That's what it said on it. And he rang me on the Saturday, and that was a Friday. He rang me on the Saturday. He'd been to a football match where the Glens had beaten Armagh 8-0, and he was then in the Raven Club having a few pints. He says, "I'll ring you in the morning. I'll have that article tidied up, and I'll get it sent through to you." And my phone went the next day at lunchtime. His number, I answered, "Hello, David." And it wasn't David, it was his son Mark, to say to me that his father was in hospital, and words to the effect that he wasn't going to do. And I couldn't get my head around this. I'd spoken to him just, a matter of hours earlier when he was in good form. But anyway, Mark said to me, they're transferring him from the Ulster to the Royal. So on the Monday I arrived at the Royal, just as he'd died. Jeanette, his wife, met me in the corridor. I was with my wife Féile. She said to me, "Would you come into the bedside?" And I thought, no, but yes, if you know what I mean. I'd far rather remembered him.
Yeah, as he had been, yeah.
In that moment,
sure.
before Christmas, when we had those few pints together. And but anyway, I went into the bedside. Gary Mason, the Methodist minister, was there. Members of David's family. They asked us to join hands. They said a prayer. I remember stepping out of that and into the corridor. And one of the big rows that was going on at that stage was about policing and justice and how it would be devolved. And there was all of this talk, not in my political lifetime, from a number of the unionist politicians. And I said to Gary Mason, "How long is a political lifetime?" Because I was thinking about talking to this man the day before, and then the news that he was in hospital, and a day or so after that he's dead. And I remember then the BBC interviewed me, and I stepped out of the hospital, and Jane Lockery interviewed me, and I think I was in shock. I just. So it was trying to reflect not just the life of a politician, but somebody who I knew personally.
Yeah.
But Jim Gibney and Tom Hartley heard that interview that I did for the BBC, and I think it was Jim who called me. And Jim said, "Tom and I'd like to go and see Jeanette." David and Tom had made a film together about the song.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And when they got back, Jeanette had driven Tom home.
Yeah.
And I think there again, a relationship had developed between David and Tom, probably around the city council.
Yeah.
But anyway, I said to Jim, I'll speak to Jeanette. There'll not be a problem. And I spoke to Jeanette, and of course there wasn't a problem. The next problem was how to get the two of them up to the top of the Braniel estate. So I said to Jim, "You and Hartley stand at the front of the City Hall tomorrow, and my wife will pick you up." And I said, "I'll be at the house when you get that far." So Val drove them up the Albert Bridge Road, up the Upper New North Road, up into the Braniel estate. They arrived, I'm in the house, and when they're there, a number of loyalists arrive. And there's not a reaction to their presence at all. In fact, there's the very opposite. "Thanks for being here."
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. And I remember as we left the house, I left with them, and Jim or Tom said, would we be able to go back a different way? In other words, not back down the Albert Bridge Road, the New North Road out there. So we went over the Knock carriage, went down the Sydenham bypass, and remember Jim saying to Hartley, "Did you leave the mass card or the remembrance card, sympathy card?"
Yeah.
And Hartley saying, "I think I might have left the electricity bill." And but those steps that they took, then and they didn't tell anyone that they were going. I think they got a bit of a dressing down. We're not getting into all of that.
I wouldn't say dressing down, I would say probably more, why did you do it without telling me?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what that did then was that cleared the way for Adams to attend the funeral.
I want to ask you this, and I know you don't speak about your family life and all that, but you mentioned Val 4 times there.
Yeah.
And I know from speaking to people who are associates and friends of yours that Val has been the rock, the solid. And in your writing, you talk about the horror of conflict, and conflict is not about, it's not about a paragraph in a paper or a headline. It's about the family left behind and all of that. And you've spoken many times about receiving statements from the IRA about someone had been killed
Loyalists.
or and yeah, right across the board, or going to cover an event that has happened and all of that. Is Val kind of, this maybe sounds a bit of a naive question, but is Val, is she a strong person? I've never met her. How does she keep you sane when the world around you is insane?
Well, I couldn't have done it without her.
Yeah, well, that's
Well, that's like the starting point in all of this. So
Where did you meet?
So we met in Hollywood. Val had lived in Hollywood all her life. Met her in a pub one night. I'd gone to school with her brother. I'm 63 on Friday, he's 63 on Sunday. You know, we were...
Congratulations.
Do you say congratulations?
Well, I know, yeah, it sounds better than commiserations.
Aye, yeah. The only thing that makes me feel young still is that Mally's 70 plus, you know, so it's... but anyway, so we met, and I suppose there's this thing about kind of reporting conflict, dealing with all of those sides, having to stay strong, not be bowled over by people, hold your ground on occasions, being in situations that you don't want to be in. I tell this story, I've told this story about one night going to South Armagh. The IRA had shot dead 3 of their own people, Dignam, Stars and Burns, coming across a number of the bodies. One of them lying almost naked in the kind of middle of the road, the other one under a black bin bag with a milk crate sitting on top of it. To be honest with you, you'll not want to be there.
Of course.
Right. You know, and not wanting to be there for a whole lot of reasons. So the kind of conflict dehumanized us all.
Yeah.
People became numbers, and they became news. And I can remember then, you know, reporting on that and going home, not being home very long, when I got a call to come this direction. Eamon Malley there as well, when I arrive. The person who had asked us to be there then leaves. 2 young men arrive. They give Malley and myself a pair of dark glasses. One of them walks me out of the car, the other one walks Eamon out of the car. They give us tape to tape our eyes, put the goggles over the top of them. We're driven to a house. I'm brought in first, searched, told to take the glasses and the tape off. Malley, same procedure. A couple of men sitting in front of us in balaclavas with a long statement on why these men had been executed in the IRA's terms.
Yeah.
Writing that down, taking forever to write it down. Tape back on, glasses back on, back out into the car, dropped off. I go back to the BBC. And there's a bit of an earthquake, you know, because I think the penny's starting to drop with some people. So the sense of me being in South Armagh the night before, coming across those bodies, now being taken away by the IRA, eyes taped, goggles on. I remember Tom Kelly was the news editor at that stage. He went on to be spokesperson for Mo Mowlam and then Tony Blair.
I'd met him many times.
Yeah, I remember him asking me, did I want some counselling? And I remember being offended. You know, almost this sense, do you think there's something wrong with me? You know, that of course there was something wrong, you know, and but we in that period you were afraid to talk in your sleep. So the only person I talked to was Val.
And that's the point I was trying to...
And it took me a while to get there, but I was trying to set a context. So how do you talk to somebody about those things and that stuff? So I dealt with 5 IRA P. O'Neills. Val wouldn't have a clue who the 5 IRA P. O'Neills are. She doesn't need to know, she wouldn't want to know. But being able to sit down with with someone at least, to be able to talk about some of that stuff. Did it get to me? Absolutely, it got to me. It broke me on occasions.
Yeah.
But you couldn't show that in any public way. So where it was seen was private. But by the time I left the BBC in 2005, I was physically and mentally broken.
And I want to return to happier days, but
Yeah.
just let me say this as an observation. I have read all of your books.
God help you.
No, I read them. I read them with joy. And I think you can't see that tragedy in the writing, and you can't see that tragedy in tragedy and hope. I think is maybe an equal measure. Ceasefires.
Yeah.
Hope's the best of times and the worst of times.
Of course.
How, and I know you were key to the announcement of ceasefires and of breakthroughs and all of that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to dwell on the politics of it, but as an individual, as you, was it, it's over? Was it that sad relief? Was it, I don't know.
So 31st of August 1994, Fall's 8 months pregnant and it's her birthday. And I know at 11 o'clock the next morning, I'm going to get this statement. And I can remember getting into work in a taxi, and my phone went, and I said to the taxi driver, "Would you mind stopping?" Now, when I say my phone went, a phone in 1994 was like a brick, right? You know, it wasn't one of those things you could slip into your back pocket or whatever. But anyway, I stepped out onto the pavement, and the person on the phone said to me, "Same place as Saturday, 11 o'clock. So, bring him." Was the final meaning name in Malay. So I got into the BBC, and there's a morning meeting every morning where they discuss the news agenda of the day, and the world had arrived. You know, I mean, the BBC from London had arrived. We used to call it the invasion of the script snatchers, you know, but anyway, I knew I couldn't go into the meeting at 9:30 and say at 11 o'clock. So a small number of senior editors gathered it before that 9:30 meeting, and I explained to them that it was going to happen at 11 o'clock. So the arrangement was then made that Donna Traynor would be in a radio studio when I rang from West Belfast, at a camera on the roof of the BBC to broadcast into all of the London news outlets, because this was a world story. It wasn't a kind of local story. And I can remember going with Mally, and up around the Kennedy Centre we'd arranged to meet. We walked in to a kind of coffee shop. There's a woman sitting there. I knew that was it. She started to read the IRA statement to us on a small column. I asked her, I think after the first sentence or two, would she mind pausing? Do we phone that through for a news flash? And she told us her instructions were to read the entire statement.
That's it.
So it went on forever. And anyway, she couldn't get out of the place quick enough, because Mally and I were like two cats on a hot tin roof. And I remember walking out into the car park with this brick, and Mally said to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you think I'm doing?" He says, "I've no arrangements made." I said, "Eamon,
you're on your own."
On this one?
Yeah.
So I rang, and basically I just rang the first couple of sentences through, that the IRA had announced a complete cessation of military operations from midnight that night, that all units had been instructed accordingly, more to follow, and that was the news flash. There's a noise you hear as Donna Traynor reads it from the studio, and I think it's a chair falling over as Tom Kelly ran into the studio. I rang his number, you see, gave him those couple of lines, and he brought them into Donna, and then by the time I get back into the BBC, I was on live with Barry Khan at that stage. And I remember the unionists were saying already, it doesn't say permanent.
Yeah.
You know, so I remember when those words were read, a complete cessation of military operations, I thought to myself, I wonder what that is. And we were probably naive enough to think in 1994 that it could be some end.
Mm-hmm.
But as we all know, it was the beginning of a very long end. But to be there for those words to be read.
It's absolutely a story.
To be read.
Can I tell you
that's-
from another side of
Yeah.
that coin?
Yeah.
You were in a very privileged position because obviously most people who live in the areas where the IRA was most active didn't know. Maybe some suspected that something was going to happen, but
Yeah.
they didn't know.
Yeah.
So the first inclination that they got was you announcing it on television. So you kind of became the spokesperson for what was happening. I remember you battling with a London BBC correspondent who obviously didn't know his arse from his elbow, and you're trying to tell him how important this is. I don't know if you remember the interview, but you know, you were just about to tell him you wouldn't go in and that word, and you got it through.
Well, so and that's what I understood about that statement was that it was much more than even those in the highest places of security and intelligence were expecting.
Yeah.
They thought the IRA was going to announce a time-limited ceasefire,
Yeah.
short number of weeks, possibly 3 months. But the fact that it was a complete cessation of military operations, nothing in it about reserving the right to defensive action or anything like that, I think it threw the
Oh,
establishment.
I think so.
It threw the establishment because I used the term at the time that the cow had actually jumped over the moon, because the IRA had said for decades there would be no unilateral cessation. It was Brits out or not.
Yeah.
Basically, and so this statement was very different from all of that. But you know, the point I make about that is you know, there were I don't know how many interviews you do where you bite your tongue, but we struggled to understand this place. So how people from outside of us understand it, I think probably what I came to understand was the need to be more patient with people who weren't of us, you know, and who struggled to understand this place as we understand it.
Throughout that period, and I want to speak about it, but throughout that period, you have taken and sort of been part of or analysed many ups and downs, and I described as ceasefires and the peace processes, the best of times and the worst of times, and at times there have been opportunities that have been destroyed and lost, and through lack of courage, through lack of understanding, through lack of movement. And I've seen you been interviewed, and I've seen you trying to put stuff into some kind of a framework when others didn't. Others were looking for headlines and trying.
Yeah.
Is it unbelievably frustrating for you? And this is not a reflection on bad journalism.
No.
This is how people see things.
I work with some great journalists, you know.
Of course you do.
And
there are some.
And I mean, I learned a huge amount from the David McKittricks and the Peter Taylors of this world.
Yeah.
From many people behind the scenes. Seamus Kelders, who died a few years ago, would have been with us on all of the big occasions. You know, one of the authors of Lost Lives, one of the tallest pillars of journalistic work in the course of the conflict and peace period. So there was much more to it than me. You know, there were a small number of people who on occasions I would have confided in. Mervyn Jess, one of them.
Yeah.
A great friend, a comedian. Kept us sane on occasions, you know, and I think it would probably be okay to tell this story. I remember Seamus Kelder's father died, and I was heading up towards the wake with Jess, and I said, look, see when you get to the door, don't be doing any of that, sorry for your troubles, Mrs. Kelders. And I said, remember, they're holy statues, they're not ornaments, right? And I said, but most importantly, don't go into the front room. I'm not getting in to sit beside an open cough. So of course, Mrs. Kelders and Seamus opened the door. Sorry for your troubles, Mrs. Kelders. He's about to head into the front room, and I managed to get him into the back room, and there's this pencil drawing on the wall. And I see him looking at it, and we're sitting there with all of Seamus's relatives. We've never met the people before. Next minute he's up and he's looking at it. He said, is that Seamus's father? Somebody said, that's Polly Pio. And he looks around him and he says, that's your fault. I said, What do you mean that's my fault? He said, if you'd let me go into the front room, I would have known that wasn't Mr. Kelter's. And that was, you know, it broke the ice in the room. You know, it that ability on occasions just to ease things and calm things. So a small number of journalists I would have confided in. I remember he was allocated to work with me as we turned out of 97 into 98. You'll remember Billy Wright was shot dead in the jail.
Yeah.
Whole surge of killing. The political talks going on at that stage. I'd been asked, would I go to Féile Barracks to speak to a group of army officers on the subject of the relationship between the army and, I think the community, or communities in Northern Ireland. And I decided I didn't want to go, and I told Jess to go, but I didn't tell me how to speak at it. And so I remember him coming back and coming down the corridor, and what he wasn't calling me was...
I could imagine.
But so he arrived at the event, and he was met by a woman captain who asked him would he be needing the overhead projector, and he said he looked in this window and he could see these rows of people sitting. But being Jess, he was able to find his way through it.
Wing it?
He was able to wing it, but that became a game of bat and ball for years. And much more recently, and I'm talking about only in recent years, I get this call from Tom Elliott, the Unionist MP. Barney, would you come and speak to the Fermanagh South Tyrone Unionist Association? I will, Tom. I'm thinking, you know, Jess is in beside him. I said, what does it involve? And he says, well, you speak to the room, you could speak on the subject of legacy, and you help elect the officers of the Fermanagh South Tyrone Association. No problem, Tom, right? Put the phone down thinking that's the end of that.
Yeah.
2 weeks later, I'm in this Ulster Unionist Fermanagh South Tyrone Association meeting. On the top table, Raymond Ferguson there, can you remember Raymond?
Yes, of course, yeah.
James Cooper, Elliot, some others, maybe 100 people in the room. I give him, Tom Elliott, at the end of the night, a tin of 1690 King Billy carrots, and he gives me an Inniskill and tie, and it wasn't a jest wind up at all, but in the way
real thing.
It was the real thing, but in the way of that relationship that we had and have. He had got me without even trying to get me, you know what I mean?
Speaking of relationships, Political Purgatory, your latest book, a series of interviews and observations and all of that. I was asking someone who you know, and I'm not going to tell you who they were, just last night I was saying I was going to speak to you today, and I was asking them about the book, and they said the pity the DUP didn't read it, because their fortunes are in the book. That's all they had to do. But before you comment on that, and the book's excellent, and it's a combination. It's a journey. It's all of the things that life is about and where you go and all of that. There's a great interview with Tim Myers, and for anybody who doesn't know who Tim Myers is, Tim Myers I think is currently the assistant Chief Constable in Scotland.
He's in
Scotland.
He's Scotland.
Let me just tell you this about my experience with him. This guy must be 12 foot. He's just the biggest person I've ever seen in my life. And another life I happened to be on duty on the 12th of July at Carrickhill.
Yes.
And Tim Myers was the silver, which meant he was in charge of
Commander on the ground,
of the PSN, and very tense and all of that. At that stage, what happened was the bands that were on their way to the field, coincidentally or otherwise, stopped at Carrickhill to have a break. That's what they done every year. And they sat on their accordions and they sat beside their drums and whatever else. And there was a small group of relatives, or residents, out watching and all that. And I was there to kind of keep the peace, and he was there to keep the peace. I'd never met him before. But it fits in very nicely to the story that he told you. And he came over and he's a jam. And he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, I'm okay. And I was looking at his belly button, he was that tall. All the people who I was with were looking at me talking to the senior cop. All the cops were looking at him talking to me. He said, "Have you ever seen Teletubbies?" And I said, what?
Yeah,
And he said, no, my kids watch the Teletubbies, he said, and there's more sense in the Teletubbies than in this parade today.
But Tim was
A new breed. Of
yeah,
this.
and needed back here.
Absolutely. I will be
Urgently.
back.
So I spoke to Tim and I also spoke to Una Jennings for the book. And
Yeah.
both of them joined the PSNI around the same time. So their journey into policing is beyond that era of the RUC. I think Tim's 41 or 42, Una's 40 or 41. They have all the potential to be a chief constable by the time they're in the mid-40s.
Yeah.
You would hope it would be back here. But one of his last tasks before he left this place was to oversee the building of the emergency mortuary at Kinniger and Holywood.
This is during COVID.
It's part of the COVID response when they thought they were going to be overwhelmed by the numbers of dead. That mortuary, that building is on my daily walk, you know, and I remember when I found out it was actually going to be the mortuary. My walk didn't change, but how I thought during my walk as I walked past it was completely different. You know, how you see things. There were these kind of structures that stood out of the water. One day they looked like a line of soldiers standing to attention. One day they looked like people standing in that quiet line at a wake, waiting to pay their respects. You find that everyone, they didn't want to speak the word morgue or mortuary,
No.
but they wanted to know about it.
Yeah.
So it was a place that had, I think, the capacity to hold around 2,000 plus bodies, if that's what COVID had delivered. Thankfully, it never had to be used. But it was Tim's last job here to oversee the construction and management of that temporary facility. And while he was standing there, it played inside his head. He started to think of the conflict period. And he described a mass grave. He talked about our past being a mass grave. And I suppose what he means by that is it holds all of the competing stories, competing narratives, all of the hurts of the conflict period, all of the stuff still to be answered. And what he was thinking about was, we talk about new politics, we talk about new policing, we talk about new society, we talk about new peace, and all the time we're trying to build it on top of this mass grave. And you know better than I do that every now and again we fall over the broken stones of that conflict period, and we fall over the broken people of that conflict period, and we fall into this mass grave. And it kind of made me think as well, you know, so we now talk about the new Ireland. Are we going to try to build a new Ireland on top of the conflict period and on top of the mass grave? And that became, you know, one of the big thoughts in the opening to that book. I mean, my view about a new Ireland is it needs to be a blank sheet conversation. What is the new Ireland? What is the northern political construct within it? What is unionism and Britishness and identity within the new Ireland? How does it work island-wide in terms of education and health? Is it economically viable and creditable? What's the transition period? Who supports it? What's the EU's role in it? What's the US government's role in it? The role of the two governments. And I think the big learning from Brexit is that we should be able to answer those questions before we ask them.
Although I think the book is a series of interviews, and there, you know, there's other stuff in it. There's Martin McGuinness's, there's Jerry and Jerry Adams that is in it. I think the book goes beyond almost a party political broadcast. I think the book allows you, as you say, to see that.
Well, I asked those people to write in their own words.
Yeah, so I think it allows you to see that conversation.
That wasn't, those weren't done as interviews. So whether it was Peter Robinson or Naomi Long or Claire Bailey or Una Jennings or Julian Smith, the Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, wrote the foreword to it. I actually write in the book about the first time I met him. So I met him at a breakfast in August 2019 at Stormont House, and I'd been back at the BBC for a few weeks because we were 25 years on for the ceasefires, or from the ceasefires, and I was doing some reporting for the BBC. Not a look back to 1994, but more a kind of where are we now in 2019, 25 years after the ceasefire. With no Stormont at that stage.
That's right, Stormont.
So we were in a political war with no past process, with a legacy war. That standoff at Stormont was very obvious. And I remember Julian Smith doing the rounds of the room, talking to various journalists. It was a media breakfast. I was standing with Sam McBride, who wrote the book Burned on RHI. John Campbell, who's the BBC's business and economic editor, Gareth Gordon, the political correspondent, when he stepped into our company. He was with a woman called Rosemary Neal, who was the chief communications officer at the NIO. There was a minute or two of introduction, and I said to him, I take it we're not here for a cosy chat. And he said, no, we're not, Brian. And I said, well, your department's part of the problem. And his response was, tell me more. So I can imagine other secretaries of state would have walked straight on by.
Yeah.
Very interesting, you know, and
see you later.
He wanted to hear. And what I meant by that was that the Tory DUP arrangement in London had poisoned everything here. And unless he could lead a process with Simon Coveney, it was going nowhere. The fact that he listened struck me as this was somebody different. And we then learned about it being different. He goes to Derry on a Friday night for a pint with Colm Eastwood in the bar that Colm's wife Rachel owns in Derry. He's on the Shankill Road at 7 a.m. in the morning having a breakfast meeting with the Loyalists. He takes the process outside the Stormont bubble. He takes it to where it was in that period, 97, 98, where everyone has a voice in the conversation. And he's rolling the pitch. And he's preparing the ground because he knows at some stage he and Coveney may well have to present a document if the five parties can't agree. And what he was doing in 2019 into 2020 was what the DUP didn't do in February 2018, where they didn't prepare the ground for the draft agreement at that stage.
And then they couldn't sell.
And it unravelled. And so Smith and Coveney, I think, saved Stormont in 2020.
We've been talking for almost an hour.
Right, okay.
And we could talk for another 3, I have to say.
Yeah.
But what I'd like to bring you back to, and you talked about that intensity of being a journalist in the front line, and it's you know, the phone calls in the middle of the night and all the kind of unpleasant stuff and the pleasant stuff. Do you enjoy being a grandfather? I believe you babysit even.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Aoife is with us on.
I have an Aoife.
She's 18 months now, so she was born just before the lockdown. So we'd seen her for the first 2 or 3 months. We then were talking to her on videos for 3 or 4 months. But she's with us. She's with us every week now, and it's a whole new world. It's a reminder of what's important in life, and it is an escape from what I had to do. I mean, I said to you, Joe, that when I left the BBC in 2005, I was wrecked. I was just physically and mentally drained. And one of the things I was reading over before I did this interview, I was reading over the period of October 1993. So the Shankill bomb happens. You've all the killings that happen in between. You've Grey Steel. I remember interviewing you on the day of Thomas Begley's funeral.
Right. Yeah.
You and Ronnie Flanagan trying to manage that funeral in Belfast in such a poisonous atmosphere. That office that was the target of the IRA bomb in October 1993. I'd have been in and out of that office
dozens of times.
I can always remember the smell as you went in the door, and I never associated with the fishmongers next door. And until that day, and I was on the Shankill Road, you know, not a long time after the bomb exploded. I remember the statements. I remember at that stage I thought we were going over the edge. You know, that week was just
horrific.
You talk about the phone calls.
Horrific.
You know, my phone went in that period every night. And when you're lying in bed and the phone goes and you know it's going to be somebody dead, or a bomb has exploded, or somebody's injured, or something major has happened. So that's a huge weight to carry. I use this term that the mind's wardrobe doesn't allow us to throw things out. And I do think about it much more now than I did in actual time. And my biggest regret is that we treated the conflict period as numbers and news. We forgot about people. We all became dehumanized. And I think the best thing we can do to remember the conflict period is to remember all of those who died. Those who died on their own, who didn't die in the big headlines. And I think if we don't find a way of dealing with the past, then we're going to bury ourselves in it, and we're going to bury the generations that come behind us in that conflict period as well. We need to wise up.
And those very prolific words, and our time has run out, and I regret that, and we'll have you back at some stage.
Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that.
But I was going to ask you, are you a good grandfather? But I think you've explained that anyway. You're certainly a doting grandfather. So keep that for another interview.
We'll do that.
Barney,
Thanks
thank
for your
you.
time.
You've been a great guest, and it's been a wonderful interview.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.